So I have a feeling there's probably Q&A. Okay.
Yeah, I'll just yell.
Okay.
I'm interested in hearing your take on Stone Mountain, Georgia, and maybe a little history and maybe what are people thinking and what could be done there.
Yeah, Stone Mountain, and that's in the news today because there's a rally there. One of the things about that memorial is that it's striking of how long it took to create it and its final completion. And that's something for my students. They're like, I thought that was done in the 20s. I'm like, it's later. So I always frame that one in particular of, this is the civil rights movement that this is coming up. And how do the Black communities around Stone Mountain use that site? Because one of the things, if you go there, other than the light show that happens at night, which is fascinating, on this Mount Rushmore of Confederate generals, is that is a prime walking spot for Black women walkers. During the daytime, it's like 40 people who are always walking, and they just don't, they're like, yeah, it's there, we just ignore it. So one of the things I'm thinking about that can be done, because they're fighting over it, it's just massive. And so projections of a different type is one of the easiest solutions. Instead of the night show and the kind of thinking about what the war meant, have new ones. So having my friend who does hip hop studies out of Atlanta, Morris Hobson and Gina Bradley suggested, where's Outkast? Where's Maynard Jackson? Where's Black Atlanta on this? Bringing them into to this monument and saying like, yeah, we have this, but we also have this history too. The other thing I've heard was completely sandblasting it and putting something new up. That's just expensive. That's a funding campaign. I'm not sure if there's a will to fundraise for that. So I was thinking more different types of projections at night, a more frank history, but also to how it's being used for still the portrayal of certain types of memorials and memorialization on there. I think that could be one of the things where we don't need to have a rally today at Stone Mountain, but we can have a different type of taking that history. And I think that's one of the things with Stone Mountain is one of the more challenging. What do you do with this massive structure? And it's literally carved on the side of the mountain. And that's going to be a little bit more imagination. But George Floyd and the memorials in Richmond showed me projections work. And that, I think, is something is very easy to do. And if you change those projections, you also change the meaning of that memorial, and you also recognize the long history of that space by bringing other voices in. And I think that would be the easiest right now and the least expensive option. Yes.
So obviously education is at the core of all of this. Your shoulders must be very happy. Thank you for all that you're doing. But what I'm struck with when I listen to you is in tandem with all of this that's going on with the monuments, this pressure and this movement to shut critical race theory down. And without that, our children, or even, people of our age, are not going to know what happened. So what's your thinking about that?
Yeah, this is where I will say this. I grew up in the 80s. And I remember one of the things about growing up and having to drive 15 hours, 23 hours to South Carolina every summer, because we had to break that up from Massachusetts. No AC in that car either. And then 9 hours to my grandparents in Pennsylvania. Is education is not confined to just the classroom. My parents and who they introduced me to, their porch stories, my grandparents and the other community members of the civil rights movement, the histories of the community, like this is where you're from. This is the history, museums, walking all over a city. I have walked around Charleston so much, my dad's like, can we just get shade? Like, can we just walk in shade? And not in the sun. But they made sure education was confined to just my classroom, that my textbook in 3rd grade said, talked about the Civil War, but Reconstruction was a mistake. And I'm like, people get freedom. Like, that's my dad's side of the family. Why is that a mistake? Because my dad took me to Charleston. We were there. We were on those sea islands. We learned all that history. I went to Gettysburg all the time. It was that education, my parents, the community, the librarians, the aunties, the uncles, and everyone else that raised. I think we need to go to a community-based model and think about what our freedom schools look like. How can we use these spaces on a weekend to educate the next generation because they can't get in the classroom? How can we do tours, whether it's to Birmingham, Alabama, or to the monument itself? Let's come out and see this before. Let's talk about the history. How can we as community citizens engage in lifelong learning, help educate the next generation? And this is where I think where we have more power, but I also know those memorials that when they came up is the same time of the textbook campaign. And I know Mamie Garvin Fields talks about her cousin who operated a school in her backyard. And her cousin taught her that this didn't always have to be. That education, I think, is important. So I always say the formal, we all have those debates and challenges. So I'd like to go to school board meetings, start going to school board meetings, start thinking about those little libraries and alternate books, but how to educate beyond just the classroom. And I think all of us can do that work. I see a hand back there.
Another kind of in our backyard, the rebranding of a lot of plantations to a lot of place in response to that awful post. I was just curious if you feel like that's enough, or if you know if they're doing more in terms of education.
I know they're trying to. They have reached out, but this is one of the things about coming new to a community and hitting the ground running, because Davidson is doing a lot of work on its history, and they're putting up a new memorial, and I've been doing a lot of that. So I haven't had a chance to see what else the area community efforts are doing for that plantation renaming. But I know come fall, with my book in, I have time. So this is where I really think about how to partner with my classes, how to bring in students, internships, other ways to be an ally, even if I can't always be there. Another one is in the Rock Hill, South Carolina area, the 144 enslaved graves that were found on a person's property, and doing that work. So I'm also thinking about what's the other history around us, how to get students and internships and writing and DCs on this to spotlight so students know. Because one of the things I learned is there's a lot of things with service-based learning. And if I can't do it, I have all the time students who are always looking for these opportunities. And if I know that there's an opportunity, as long as it's not in hindrance with vehicle and transportation, I'm like, I have a student for you who can do this work. And so I'm really starting to think about who are the partners and partnerships, and I'm really good friends with Willie Griffin from UNC Charlotte. We went to grad school together. And so his work at UNCC, Karen Cox is a really great friend of mine, Chris Cameron, others. How can we use the networks around? So always think about those opportunities to think about, if I can't do it, who can? And that's one of the things I think is going forward, what we can do. But it's going to be slow. It's going to be not fast. And so for me, I'm the more stable one. My students are there for 4 years. As long as I'm the stable one, we can make sure there's an ongoing structure.
Is it reasonable or a stretch to connect the recent North Carolina Supreme Court rulings to the history you shared with us?
No, it's not a stretch. One of the things when I look at with these memorials, it took state by state action to get Jim Crow to happen. And it wasn't just the Supreme Court on the national level, it was state courts too. And so the two things that were used to roll back Reconstruction gains, and I'll use my former state because they were the clearest in their constitutional convention. When John Knox, who's the head of their convention, said, we want white supremacy by law and not fraud. And that's a subheading in the 1901 Constitution of Alabama Convention. You have to target education. So that's why I'm not surprised by the target of CRT and textbooks and who's in the classroom banning the books, because that was done earlier. The other thing that was done too was voting. And why you have that parallel. The voting won in Knox and other segregationists, including North Carolina and all the various states that had either new constitutions or legislation, used their courts and their legislatures accordingly. They knew that they had to prevent the current generation of people who knew better, knew and understood their rights, to not grow. So they're looking at second, third, fourth generation. So if you don't have a system that nurtures and caters on a formal system, you block out voting and make it more difficult and people become apathetic. You need both. Apathetic in the classroom, apathetic at the voting box. And then you can keep on doing things like that. So that parallel of the monuments, but also what else is going on, went hand in hand. The one thing we haven't really seen, which I hope does not come back, but my students think about this all the time, is the lynching violence. And they're looking at the mass shootings differently and how they're like, are we going to get to this part? I'm like, I hope not. But I know I'm seeing some parallels. I always say history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. We are rhyming right now. Yes.
I had a question about the unveiling during the President's inauguration. The unveiling during the inauguration. And while I was there, I was thinking about, what you're saying about we can make new and we can create a different space. And with what you're saying, I'm seeing a parallel with, we didn't have a monument in Davidson College, but the campus itself was a little bit of a monument in how it perpetuated these systems of violence. And now there's a new thing being created. But what I'm grappling with is, how do we sit in history and sit in sadness and trauma while also moving forward? How do we keep that balance?
Yeah, that is something I think about all the time. And I turn to James Baldwin. And a quote that he has is like, the past is never the past. But it's not the same as drowning in it. You can sit with that past, you can understand and use it, but you don't have to drown in that past. You don't have to be hindered so that you can't move forward from that past. So for me, one of the things I will say that with the new memorial, which I was a part of the process and the selection process from 65 artists that narrowed it down to 10, that narrowed it down to the ones that we had. It was a 2-year process just to get to here. I looked at this in the archive says servants and hands. We don't have names. And so I get students in the archive sitting with that reality. And they start to shut down. They're like, we couldn't write a name. I'm like, but we have a hand. So I call unknown as our name. How do we sit with the unknown and let the unknown be revealed later on? And so one of the things that had happened since the unveiling and sitting with that past and this rush to locate descendants, I'm like, there's nothing here to have people want to tell their history because they weren't listened to before. This is a step to get people to say, we have changed, we're listening. because other communities have sat with that past, maybe Davidson has to sit with our past and learn that we don't know, we did harm. But this is how we're gonna move forward. So I had 6 emails within 48 hours of descendants of the hands and servants who had not been self-identified before. And their first response was, thank you. We've been trying for decades to get Davidson to listen. Sometimes it's the mere acknowledgement and to sit with, okay, we might be uncomfortable, but what harms are we doing by not acknowledging it? And how do we sit with the past and use it as we're not drowning, but how we can do better? And I think that's one of the biggest things to do. And so I teach a class on race and campus histories. And my students created an essay projects. I'll be posting them online on my website soon. They were doing the desegregation past of Davidson from 1962 to the 2013 graduation of Kenesha Gaston. And they were in the archives. And they noticed students of 1972 in a senior thesis, half the black students, there were 15 of them, all wanted to leave. And then they read Project 1987, same demands, no progress. And then they related to their experiences. They're like, maybe we need a new project that says, okay, we've done this, where are we going next? They also looked at the BSC and the pioneers whose shoulders they're standing on. And they were like, okay, I'm standing on their shoulders, whose shoulders are going to be stood on mine later on. It was a different attitude because they had to see the resilience too. So it's not just the trouble in history, it's the resilience that people who push forward. That past too needs to come up. And so how do we bring both pasts in there so we're not drowning, but we're finding a past that's usable to move forward? All right, let's see. Last question.
A little bit different slant. It certainly seems that many of the monuments have been coming down, but the catalyst has been social action, social justice driven. And I'm going to switch over and say, but the Supreme Court ruled that corporations are citizens as well, as we see our good friend Disney has been exercising their right as a citizen. What role does the corporate world play in this action? Because we've certainly seen people like the NBA, the NFL, and the NCAA, when an issue has occurred with respect to racial injustice, they've responded in a very visceral way. As a citizen, as a corporation citizen, what role, if any, do they play in this whole process?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something I've seen. It was one of the CSX, I believe, Norfolk Southern in Atlanta. They had a monument removed, and they did it on their own accord. And it was after Charlottesville. They're like, this no longer reflects our values. But not only did they remove a monument, they actually did a targeted hiring campaign partner with Georgia Tech and others. So they also changed how they saw their culture mirroring, not the culture of the time of the placement of the monument, but their overall structure. And so they did an action not pressured by anyone, they just did it on their own. So how do we get those corporations that to act on their own in partnerships? And this is where partnerships with universities and college campuses, and Florida's gonna have a major drain of professors. I have several friends right now, they're in UT system who are all leaving. And they have brought millions of dollars to the states because of NSF and the NIH grants. And they're gonna take that money with them. And even Arizona, that's one of the monuments out there, how do you have a college campus that's the cutting edge of leadership, research, and development if you don't have the academics and the student population nearby? And a lot of corporations as citizens are like, they're looking for their future too. And those pipelines that they had established with this institution. So it's gonna be more of how do they see possibly their pocketbook, but also the loss of access to the talent that they had readily through their backyard that's going to bring about change. And I see Florida and Disney being one, but the biggest one I'm looking at is NASA with Hampton Roads and the universities and college campuses around there, DOD, Huntsville with the rocket boosters, Arizona State Pharmaceutical Development, Arizona. I'm looking at them. I'm like, okay, what's Boeing doing? What's Lockheed Martin doing? What are they doing now in this reality as corporate citizens when their pipelines for those institutions of higher ed are doing one? And I think that's going to be the way corporations are going to bring in.